Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Well, the philosophical discussions on miracles and free will suffer from an excess of conceptual pluralism, from a flood of metaphysically motivated conceptual decisions that are not made explicitly, but are transported in rhetorically veiled forms. Unsurprisingly, the logical consequences of these decisions are often overlooked or misjudged or confused. The overall result is a cacophony of countless voices, each voice trying without much avail to be louder than other voices in the fracas. I'm afraid there's nothing that can be done about this situation, which is of a kind deplorably well known in philosophy, except to offer some amount of clarification and orientation. And this is what I will attempt to do in this paper. My conceptual decisions will be made explicitly and as clearly as I am able to make them. I believe that my personal choice of concepts in the miracles and free will debate is at least as good a choice as anyone's. On the basis of my choice of concepts, I will demonstrate that there is no breach of rationality committed by those believers in miracles or free will, or both, who stick to that choice of concepts. There is a handout to this talk, and I strongly recommend it because it will help you to keep track of my assertions, denials, and also of the things I leave open. Miracles first, then free will, then miracles and free will. In everyday life, any event that happens, although one very reasonably expected that it would not happen, is prone to be called a miracle. Thus, one concept of miracle is this: event that takes place contrary to perfectly reasonable expectations. However, this concept of miracle has the undesirable side effect that there are altogether too many miracles if it is chosen. Choosing an entirely objective concept of miracle, one entirely without internal reference to human subjectivity, seems basically the best way to go. A concept such as event that takes place contrary to the laws of nature. This definition of miracle I take to be basically correct in the sense and to the extent in which definitions can be basically correct. But what are laws of nature? Without entering deeply into a discussion of the various answers that have been given to this difficult philosophical question, and of course a comprehensive discussion cannot be provided here, it is nevertheless imperative to make at least one conceptual decision here and now. One either must take a law of nature to be something that cannot be broken, or one must take a law of nature to be something that can be broken. If one decides that conceptually a law of nature cannot be broken, then a miracle is, I submit, conceptually still an event happening contrary to the laws of nature, which laws, however, cannot be broken. Thus, as a consequence of this conceptual decision on laws of nature, it turns out that for purely conceptual reasons, there cannot be any miracles. There are no miracles. Turns out to be an analytical, a broadly logical truth. And those who, on the contrary, believe that there are miracles are made to look conceptually incompetent, incapable of thinking logically. To expose others, especially colleagues, as logically incompetent is a great temptation for philosophers, especially for analytic philosophers. The temptation must be resisted, however. It is indeed demanding too much to demand that no philosophical question of importance should be decided by choice of concepts alone. But certainly the question at hand should not be decided in this way. Too many decent people, most of them non-philosophers, have believed in miracles. What we might term conceptual arrogance is entirely out of place here. On the other hand, one must not make being a miracle too easy for an event. If a miracle were defined as an event which happens contrary not to the laws of nature, but to what we, or rather our best experts, think are the laws of nature, then being a miracle would turn out to be a status that is too easily accessible for an event. Correlatively, the concept of miracle in question is not purely objective, but relative to human subjectivity. And to boot, it is relative to time. It might happen due to changes in what we think are the laws of nature, that one and the same event is not a miracle for some time and then becomes a miracle, or is a miracle for some time and then becomes a non-miracle. While the belief that an event is a miracle or that it is a non-miracle should, of course, be conceptually allowed to come and go in the course of time, the event's being a miracle or being a non-miracle itself should not be conceptually allowed to come and go in the course of time. Either an event is a miracle always, or it never is, was, or will be a miracle. This, I submit, is a reasonably undeniable conceptual truth. The reasons that have just been adduced against defining miracles as events happening contrary to what we think are the laws of nature can also be adduced against defining miracles as events happening contrary to the laws of nature if the concept of law of nature itself is not purely objective, but dependent on our beliefs and attitudes, and thereby on the vicissitudes of our beliefs and attitudes. In view of defining the concept of miracle, it may seem an advantage if laws of nature are taken to be conceptually dependent on human subjectivity. For such laws of nature are, of course, capable of being broken. But I nevertheless resist the idea that laws of nature are conceptually dependent on human subjectivity. A perfectly objective concept of miracle is what best fits the intentions of those who speak of miracles. And a perfectly objective concept of miracle requires a perfectly objective concept of law of nature. Moreover, as we have seen, a philosophically interesting concept of miracle on the basis of contrariness to the laws of nature requires that laws of nature can be broken. And of course, it requires in the first place that there are laws of nature. In what follows, I will proceed on the assumption that there is a perfectly objective concept of law of nature, that there are items which satisfy that concept, that the items which satisfy that concept, the laws of nature themselves, all of them perfectly objective, can nevertheless be broken, can be counter-instantiated. The only question is whether they ever are counter-instantiated in actual fact, by actual events. This question cannot be decided by the evidence that can be adduced on either side, the yes side and the no side. On either side, the evidence ultimately comes down to the testimony of witnesses. A tiny minority claims that it has become personally acquainted with a miracle. A vast majority claims that it has never ever become personally acquainted with any miracle. On both sides, the evidence adduced does not rationally force assent to the thesis for which it is adduced as evidence. Being subjectively convinced, together with a few others, that one has become personally acquainted with a miracle does not entail that there is a miracle. Being subjectively convinced, together with many, many others, that one has never ever become personally acquainted with any miracle does not entail that there is no miracle. There is not even a preponderance of objective rationality on either side, for the only objective rationality is logical rationality, the rationality of consistency and entailment. Keep in mind that I said objective rationality. Subjective rationality is something else. And it is not more logically rational to believe that there are no miracles than it is to believe that there are miracles, and vice versa. The question of the existence of miracles can only be decided by what is the objective truth in this matter. It is impossible to go through every argument that has been brought forward against the existence of miracles. They are all unsuccessful. For purposes of illustration, here is an argument that many have been taken in by. If there were miracles, so the argument goes, science would be impossible and everyday life would be very different from what it actually is. Because if there were miracles, the course of the world would be unpredictable. But evidently, science is not impossible and everyday life is as it is. The course of the world evolves along predictable, sometimes perfectly predictable lines. Therefore, there are no miracles. Thus the argument. This argument relies on the implicit assumption that if there were miracles, there would be many of them in the course of time. This assumption is unfounded. Quite the opposite is true. Events which take place contrary to the laws of nature are very rare in the course of time. They are absolute exceptions, if there are such exceptions. Note that there would be no point in calling certain rules laws of nature if in the course of time they were frequently broken. They certainly are not frequently broken, but at most sporadically. Thus it is reasonable to suppose that if, for example, the miraculous events that are recounted in the Bible have actually occurred, that then science as we know it and everyday life as we know it remain entirely unaffected, remain just as we know them to be. If those events have actually occurred, then the laws of nature which rule the course of the world are still the laws of nature. They do not disappear by having been broken, as little as the laws of a state disappear by having been broken. then the laws of nature are still there, being obeyed by the course of events, being objects of scientific research. All that has to change, if the Bible tells the truth, are certain maximal metaphysical claims that some philosophers have made on behalf of the laws of nature. Those claims have to be dropped, not science and not the way in which we lead our everyday lives. I turn to free will. Vast amounts of intellectual ingenuity have been spent and still are spent on attempts to make free will conceptually compatible with determinism. And no doubt the highest ambition of not a few philosophers in this field is to show that free will actually requires determinism, that there can be no free will without determinism. I have to admit that I'm somewhat tired of all this, that I feel somewhat bored by it. Free will is the capacity to determine which one of certain alternative nomological possibilities for the future, each of which is not already otherwise determined to be actual and not already otherwise determined to be non-actual, will be actual. Determinism, on the other hand, is a doctrine that the laws of nature suffice to effectively determine the entire course of the world, the actual world, given what has already happened in the world up to any given present. Thus, if determinism is true, then there never are alternative nomological possibilities for the future. There is always only one nomological possibility for the future, no matter how far one looks into the future. And that possibility is already determined to be actual. Therefore, under determinism, there is no free will. To admit this seems to me simply a matter of intellectual honesty. Determinism is a metaphysically respectable doctrine. The same, however, is true of indeterminism. There is evidence on both sides. The evidence for determinism is the predictability. The evidence for indeterminism, the unpredictability of certain events, certain actual events. Some actual events are perfectly predictable. Most actual events are not perfectly predictable. Some of them are perfectly unpredictable. On both sides, the evidence is insufficient for forcing rational assent. But does not the venerable principle of sufficient reason require the truth of determinism? No, it doesn't. Though it is perhaps true that every actual event has a sufficient reason for its taking place, it does not logically follow that the laws of nature, together with the antecedent course of the world, are a sufficient reason for the taking place of every, or indeed any, actual event. In particular, the principle of sufficient reason does not logically exclude that for some actual event or other, the sufficient reason for its taking place is the actuated free will of a personal agent. That the actuated free will of a personal agent is the sufficient reason for the taking place of an event seems especially plausible with regard to those events which are considered to be deliberate activities. Now, one of the most deliberate activities I can think of is a person's publicly taking a stand on a philosophical issue, for example, on the issue of free will, for example, by publicly denying its existence or by publicly affirming its existence while at the same time maintaining determinism. Sometimes philosophy can certainly seem a very strange, a somewhat absurd affair. At least it can seem so to me. The existence of free will entails indeterminism, as we have seen. This logical fact, however, cannot be used for establishing indeterminism, for the existence of free will is at least as much in doubt as is indeterminism itself. The subjective appearance of free will is, of course, not in doubt. We are appeared to as if we had free will, and therefore as if determinism were false and indeterminism true. Vast amounts of intellectual ingenuity have been spent and still are spent on attempts to expose the appearance of free will as an illusion, as a perhaps experientially unavoidable but intellectually, for sure, recognizable and falsifiable illusion, and on attempts to show that this illusion, although it is an illusion, makes nevertheless perfect psychological and biological sense. Biologically meaningful illusion. I am afraid no efforts in this direction will ever make the appearance of free will go away or lessen its considerable power to convince. In fact, its power to convince is almost overwhelming. The belief that we have free will is suggested to us with an even greater force than the belief that there's a world outside of our minds or the belief that there are other minds. Nevertheless, the appearance of free will, the subjective appearance of free will, can, of course, be intellectually resisted. It can be resisted regarding its truth content, its veracity. The appearance of free will simply does not prove the existence of free will. The existence of free will, in the incompatibilist sense I have proposed, entails indeterminism. It does not follow from this elementary logical fact that indeterminism, conversely, entails the existence of free will. The incompatibilist conception of free will I have proposed is entirely free of the absurdity that indeterminism and the existence of free will are logically equivalent. This absurdity, therefore, cannot be used for constructing a reductio ad absurdum of the proposed incompatibilist conception of free will. In particular, it cannot be held against that incompatibilist conception of free will that it conflates free action with chance. If the temporal evolution of the world is indeterministic, it nevertheless does not have any gaps. At every moment of time, there still is an actual world event, and no more than one actual world event. Under indeterminism, the laws of nature, together with the antecedent course of the world at any given time, cannot be responsible for this conspicuous gaplessness. What is it then that is responsible for it? It is either the actuated free will of one or more agents, or chance, or a combination of actuated free will and chance. If the principle of sufficient reason is true, then actuated free will, in other words, free action, is the only factor in producing, under indeterminism, the gaplessness of the course of the world. But if free will does not exist and the temporal evolution of the world is nevertheless indeterministic, then chance is the only factor in producing the gaplessness of the course of the world, and the principle of sufficient reason is, of course, not true then. For chance is entirely unable to provide a sufficient reason for the taking place of any event that takes place. On the contrary, chance entails, whenever it is invoked with respect to an actual event, the absence of a sufficient reason for that event's taking place. Thus, speaking of chance as producing something or explaining something or being responsible for something is a strictly figurative and, unfortunately, also a somewhat misleading use of language. In theology, one sometimes hears disparaging talk about the God of the gaps. For many contemporaries, the true God of the gaps is chance. An actuation of free will can be entirely arbitrary. This does not turn that actuation into an instance of chance, for an actuation of free will makes an event come about. Chance never ever makes any event come about. And an actuation of free will may perfectly follow the uniquely determined advice of rationality. This does not turn that actuation into an instance of determination by reason, for in its actuations, free will is free to follow or not to follow the advice of rationality. By the definition of free will, an actuation of free will is always a sufficient reason for some nomological possibility which is not already otherwise determined to be actual and not already otherwise determined to be non-actual, to be actual. This is a causal sufficiency. It is an actuality producing sufficiency. The sufficiency of an actuation of free will, its efficiency, or better, its efficacy, logically allows that the actuation is perfectly rationally justifiable in terms of the values and beliefs of the agent who has free will. At the same time, it does not logically require that the actuation in question be to any extent rationally justifiable in terms of the values and beliefs of the agent who has free will. As everything is what it is and not something else, so free will is what it is and not something else. The principle of identity is indeed trivial. Obeying it in philosophy is hard, as in other cases, so also in the case of free will. It is time to connect the concept of free will and the concept of miracle. What is the logical relationship of these two concepts? Consider the following argument. Every actuation of free will in the incompatibilist sense, must induce a miracle, an event that takes place contrary to the laws of nature. Therefore, since the laws of nature cannot be broken, there can be no actuation of free will, which means that there is no free will. This line of thinking, an attempt at a reductio ad absurdum of the incompatibilist conception of free will, takes several things for granted, which cannot be taken for granted. First, it takes for granted and cannot reasonably take for granted that laws of nature cannot be broken, hence that there cannot be any miracles. I have argued that it is possible and not unreasonable to conceive of laws of nature as items that can be broken and yet remain laws of nature. I have argued that the existence of miracles is possible and that whether there actually are miracles is an open question. A philosophically open question. It's not an open question for a believer, of course. Second, the argument under consideration takes for granted and cannot take for granted that every actuation of free will must induce an event that takes place contrary to the laws of nature. In other words, it takes for granted and cannot take for granted that every actuation of the capacity to determine which one of alternative nomological possibilities for the future, given the past, will be actual, must lead to the occurrence of an event, the occurrence of which is contrary to the laws of nature. It is a logical mystery to me how the determination of such a nomological possibility for actualness, that is, the determination of an event for actualness that is possible under the laws of nature, not excluded by them, even given the past, could, let alone must, produce the occurrence of an event, the occurrence of which is contrary to the laws of nature. Consider in this context an analogy which I believe to be helpful. Do not also indeterministic games have rules? And is it not possible for someone participating in an indeterministic game to determine his actual move in a given game situation from several possible moves allowed by the rules in that situation, without producing a move that violates the rules? The true logical relationship between the concept of free will in the incompatibilistic sense and the concept of miracle is that logically there can be free will, this capacity, and the actuation of free will, the actuation of this capacity, without any miracles ever existing. And the converse of this is also true. Logically, there can be miracles without any actuation of free will ever existing, and without even the capacity of free will itself ever existing. Recall that a miracle is simply an event that takes place contrary to the laws of nature. Logically, a chance event, for the occurrence of which, qua chance event, there is no sufficient reason, can take place contrary to the laws of nature and thus be a miracle. Logically, no agent and no free will is necessary for the existence of miracles. Logically, they might simply happen for no reason at all. From the logical or conceptual point of view, there can be free will without miracles and miracles without free will. And the coexistence of miracles and free will is not excluded either. Putting it in a different idiom, there are possible worlds where miracles occur, but no events that are induced by, no events which occur as the result of an actuation of free will. For example, worlds in which nothing has even the capacity of free will. There are possible worlds where events occur that are induced by an actuation of free will, but no miracles. Such worlds are perfectly law-obeying, but not deterministic worlds. There are also possible worlds where miracles occur and events that are induced by an actuation of free will. This is true, although there cannot be any event which is both a miracle and induced by an actuation of free will. There is no possible world where an actuation of free will induces a miracle. The impossibility in question is simply a consequence of the definition of free will here used and of the definition of miracle here used. The definition of free will entails that an event must be nomologically possible if it is induced by an actuation of free will. The definition of miracle, however, entails that an event must be nomologically impossible if it is a miracle. Therefore, an event which is both a miracle and induced by an actuation of free will would have to be both nomologically impossible and nomologically possible which is logically impossible. The logical impossibility for an event to be both a miracle and at the same time induced by an actuation of free will may seem dismayingly counterintuitive in view of the fact that most alleged miracles are generally regarded as effects of the free action of a divinely powerful agent. Here it must be noted that there's a much more demanding concept of free will than the one that I have been discussing in this paper. According to that concept, free will is the capacity to determine which one of certain alternative logical possibilities, logical, not nomological, but logical possibilities for the future, given the past, will be actual, overriding, if necessary, any positive or negative determination in this respect that may happen to be already in place. An event that is induced by an actuation of free will, which is being conceived of in this absolute hyperbolic sense, it's a sense of omnipotence, can of course be a miracle. Returning to free will in the normal sense, to free will we, human beings, may have. I note that there are, moreover, possible worlds where neither miracles occur nor events that are induced by an actuation of free will. Every, not just law-obeying, but deterministic possible world is such a world, and an indeterministic possible world is such a world too, if and only if chance alone fills all the gaps of determination in that world without violating any of its laws of nature. Many people these days believe that the actual world, this world, is precisely this, an indeterministic possible world in which chance alone fills all the gaps of determination without violating any of the given laws of nature. Which world, therefore, is a world without miracles and without events that are induced by an actuation of free will, its indeterminism notwithstanding. Is this really the truth about this world, the actual world? What is somewhat difficult to deny these days, in view of quantum mechanics, is that the actual world is an indeterministic world. I do believe that the actual world is an indeterministic world. In addition, however, it seems to me entirely plausible, in view of the phenotype of the actual world, in particular in view of the evolutionary drama of non-human and human life, that at least some of the gaps of determination in the actual world are filled by events that occur not by chance, as one says, but are induced by consciousness-guided actuations of free will. Indeed, if the principle of sufficient reason is assumed, then every gap of determination in the actual world must be filled by an event that is induced by an actuation of free will. But perhaps the principle of sufficient reason can be denied. It is certainly not a logical principle, although in the past, great philosophers, Leibniz, for example, treated it as being on a par with the logical principles. The principle of sufficient reason is a metaphysical principle, distinguished by its high degree of prima facie rationality, far surpassing in this respect any principle of the causal closure of the physical world. Curiously, assuming that principle of sufficient reason, leads very quickly to the conclusion that there is an agent with at least quasi-divine capacities, at least. If it is, given all that has happened before, not nomologically determined that this radium atom disintegrates now. What makes it come about then that this radium atom disintegrates now? It is a chance event, we, or most of us, nowadays say. But under the principle of sufficient reason, we cannot say this. Under the principle of sufficient reason, we must take the present disintegration of this radium atom to have a sufficient reason. And what other sufficient reason, given the absence of nomological determination, could it be than that this event, its occurrence, is induced by an actuation of free will? Whose free will could it be? Who could be interested, for some reason totally opaque to human understanding, in the disintegration of a particular radium atom on a planet without life somewhere in outer space, say? Who could even know about this atom and be able to bring about its disintegration? There is really only one plausible answer to these questions. Thank you.
Yes, needless to say that I'm very much in agreement with almost everything, but in the information for respondents, we are advised to raise objections. So, and we are also advised to not to apologize for doing so. So I will comply with that. So let's have a look on. I have two objections. I'm more convinced by the first one than by the second one, but okay. Let's have a look on this argument by Uwe Meixner. But I read it. But doesn't the venerable principle of sufficient reason require the truth of determinism? No, it does not. Though it is perhaps true that every actual event has a sufficient reason for its taking place, it does not logically follow that the laws of nature together with the antecedent cause of the world are a sufficient reason for the taking place of every, or indeed any, actual event. In particular, the principle of sufficient reason does not logically exclude that for some actual event or other, the sufficient reason of its taking place is the actuated free will of a personal agent. So let's have a closer look. What does the principle of sufficient reason say? According to Meixner, at least I think so, it says this: every actual event has a sufficient reason for its taking place. But now let's have a look at another authority on the principle of sufficient reason, namely this one. You refer to him explicitly, but your principle is not the same as Leibniz's. Our reasons are based on two great principles, that of contradiction and that of sufficient reason, by virtue of which we consider that we can find no true or existent fact, no true assertion, without there being a sufficient reason why it's thus and not otherwise. So it might be a little bit mysterious what a true explanation or a sufficient reason would be for a necessarily true assertion. But I think it's at least plausible to hold this you can restrict this Leibnizian principle in this way, as for example Prof has done, namely that every true contingent proposition has an explanation. And this is a much wider scope than your scope. And why is this important? Yeah, let's you take. It's important when we look at what is a free action for Uwe Meixner. It's sitting in a footnote. It's not an event. So this is very helpful for him, for his account, because now the principle of sufficient reason is met if an event is explained by a contingent free action, even if there is no sufficient explanation why this rather than another action took place. So you can comply to the principle of sufficient reason according to you, just by giving for every physical event or But if you take the principle of sufficient reason in its wider scope, as Leibniz did, and here's another quote, this clearly involves saying that something does happen without any sufficient reason for it, namely making that choice, which conflicts with the axiom or general rule about everything that is the case, namely the principle of sufficient reason. This involves sliding back into the loose indifference, the tolerance for the idea of choice in the absence of any reason for choosing one way rather than another, a view that I have abundantly refuted, showing it to be utterly fictional. So Leibniz is not on board, it seems at least, on board with your account. To sum up, I think Meixner's position hinges on reformulating the principle of sufficient reason and on a pretty unpopular conception of action. Even Daniel von Wachter speaks of choice events. I take this that even for Daniel von Wachter, a close ally, free actions are events. So they have to be explained by something in order to comply with the principle of sufficient reason, I take it. So now your introductory remarks begin to haunt you. The philosophical discussion on miracles and free will suffer from a flood of metaphysically motivated conceptual decisions. True enough, you are a good example. Okay.
I'm not against conceptual decisions. Cut short my quotation. What I'm really saying is that these conceptual decisions are not made explicit.
Yeah.
What I would do is I make them explicitly and clearly. Many conceptual decisions are made. The problem is not the flood. Although it
but at least it was hidden in a footnote. You didn't read it. Yeah, but okay. It's okay.
I could not define everything in the text I read out. And you are right, this my conception of action is it's not an event. An action is really the causing of the event. That the agent makes the event come about. This is the action. And of course, the event that happens then can be called, and is often called an action. My raising my arm, for example. How I would reconstruct this is there is an event, the rising of my arms, and the action is my causing this rising of my arm. Mm-hmm. Are you done already? Or
No. No. Yeah. But okay, to sum up, I don't think it's that you can claim that you really act in the spirit of the principle of sufficient reason by reformulating it so that you can. Yeah, maybe I skip this. Here's another objection, which is you should not take too seriously, but I think it's at least a better one than the one you discuss. You have said that arguments that rely on the assumption that if there were miracles, then there would be many of them, and therefore science would be impossible are unfounded. I agree totally with that. But I think there might be lurking in the neighborhood a better argument, namely one that rests on this assumption. Namely, that if there were miracles, there could be many of them. Not there would be many of them, but there could be many of them. Here's my try to make an argument out of this. Let's say if a law of nature can be broken once, it can be broken many times. If a law of nature can be broken many times, we cannot rationally rule out that there are laws of nature that are broken so often that we are unable to recognize them as laws of nature, that laws of nature have been broken much more often in the remote past than they are broken now, which will undermine the reliability of science like evolutionary biology, geology, and so on. And maybe even that laws of nature will be broken much more often in the near future than they are broken now, which will undermine the reliability of scientific predictions. So if we could not rationally rule out 2A, B, and C, this would be detrimental to epistemic authority of scientists. I think this is a real worry that many scientists have. I think they are probably wrong, but I think it's at least a better argument than the one you presented. It's not the end. So we should ceteris paribus strengthen rather than weaken the epistemic authority of scientists, even more so in times of existential crisis, let's say climate change or Brexit, that cannot be overcome without trust in scientific diagnosis. And therefore, we should not concede that natural laws can be broken, at least not without strong evidence that our best candidates for them, in fact, have been broken. So conceptual choices have been consequences in real life, let's say. And if one of these consequences is a lesser trust in science, this may be an argument against such a choice.
Possibilities do not faze us. The mere possibility that the laws of nature are broken, if it doesn't happen, well, why should we? We can die any time.
But according to your concept, it's possible that so if laws can be broken once, there might be laws that are broken so often that it's impossible to.
It does not follow from that a law is broken once. It simply does not follow that it will be broken often, or that it could be broken often. Of course, if God is the author of the miracle, then he could do it again, of course, and again and again and again. But we may have reasons for supposing that, at least for a long time to come, he won't do that. Okay. We have good reasons for that. Okay, and anyway, if I defined the concept of miracle without any reference to God. It's simply an event that takes place contrary to the laws of nature. Nothing whatever follows about the frequency of these events. As the world is, they seem to be very rare miracles. And at least rare in such a way that science can go its usual course, that we can rely on natural laws for building our bridges and our planes and so on. It could be okay, but es juckt uns einfach nicht. Okay, but perhaps to the principle of sufficient reason. The word sufficient is very important, and the word sufficient was lacking in the definition by Prof. Mm-hmm. Has an explanation. Yesterday I already had a small discussion about what explanation means. Well, if something makes something else probable, more than 50% probable, is this an explanation? I don't know. What I meant by explanation is a sufficient explanation, and that is what is demanded by the principle of sufficient reason. Every event has a sufficient reason. Sufficient means, from the reason, it must be clearly visible why it happened. Why its opposite did not happen. And that's what Leibniz wants too. He wants a sufficient reason.
But he wants also a sufficient reason for everything, for every contingent fact. And
yeah.
For actuation of
it's very easy to move from an event to a contingent fact. What explaining an event or giving a sufficient reason for an event means explaining the fact that this event happened.
So it's very closely related. Leibniz, the category of events is relatively new. So, and he's talking about facts and, or about substances having certain properties and so on. But I don't see any deep difference between Leibniz and me.
And last rejoinder, you wouldn't say that you need sufficient reason for, let's say, contrastive facts. Let's say for why do you choose rather A than B? There's no, I think in your account, there's no sufficient explanation for this kind of facts.
Well, I was looking,
so why?
A priori, I was looking at a very special sort of fact. Nomological possibilities which are incompatible, and one of them takes place, although it is not nomologically determined by the past. Why? What is the sufficient reason? And I didn't look at these other cases. So if you want, you can say what I said is the principle of sufficient reason is a specialization of a more general principle of sufficient reason, which would also cover these cases, contrastive explanations, or why rather this than that. Well, after all, it's also rather this and that. Why this possibility and not that possibility? The causal moment in the explanation is only one moment. There are other things needed, values. If you really want to understand why this possibility became real and not this other, it doesn't suffice to say, well, the agent brought this event about. You must say more. Why did you have to give final causes? You have to explain with preferences, beliefs, and so on.
Well, I begin by breaking not a natural law, but the rule of Professor von Wachter that we must not praise any speaker and that we should abstain from all that. I think your lecture was really an excellent lecture, and I want to congratulate you on this.
Thank you.
However, I will not completely disobey Professor Wachter's rules and say that I think that there was one, if I understood you correctly, that there was one flaw in your beautiful lecture, namely your definition or your understanding of miracles. You said that if there are chance events that break a rule of nature, then these are miracles. And at another point you said that a miracle cannot be the effect of a free will's action. Now, you somehow took it back a little later by speaking of God, but I think both of these things are, in my opinion, mistaken, because if you have a chance event, let's assume there would be no strict rules of nature and suddenly all of us would fly up to the ceiling without any cause, or without any cause in the laws of nature, then I would say this is certainly not a miracle, because a miracle requires that precisely requires that it is the effect of a free act, like of a divine free act, and like let's say if something just happens by chance, I don't see any reason to call it a miracle. And in fact, the concept of miracle, I think, includes more than that. It's just the caused by some some free will, like superhuman free will. But for example, if a demon worked a extraordinary change in nature, that would not be a miracle. A miracle, I think, requires not only that the breaking of the rules of nature is caused by free will, but also by a good free will. In other words, well, you could perhaps think also of demonic miracles, evil miracles, but I think the authentic notion of miracle requires more than simply that it is caused by free will or by yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is my main objection against your otherwise perfect lecture.
Well, I didn't say that every chance event is a miracle. A chance event is an event that happens without sufficient reason. You may say without any cause at all. Sufficient cause, of course, without sufficient cause. And if such a chance event, nevertheless, is in accordance with the law of nature, although it is not determined by the past and the laws of nature, is nevertheless compatible with the laws of nature, then it is, of course, not a miracle. It is a mere chance event. But I said that miracles can happen without an agent. They are chance events. They take place without no cause, without no reason at all, but they are miracles if they are not compatible with the laws of nature, but happen contrary to them, break them. Then a chance event is a miracle. So what I really said is that chance events can be miracles. I didn't say that they are always miracles. And a chance event can also be not a miracle. Most contemporaries would say that quantum events are often simply chance events, and of course they're not miracles. On what I kept in memory is you said that a demon may do something contrary to the laws of nature. He can't do that. Every created creature, now I'm speaking purely theological, of course, every created creature, and a demon is a created creature, must submit to the laws of nature. The laws of nature are not necessarily only what the laws of physics are, of course.
I think Christian's right in his that you and Leibniz are not on the same page, and I wanted to suggest to you that you ought to say, well, Leibniz is just wrong. It's not the first time, anyway. So, and I think he put this finger on the issue, which concerns whether or not undetermined events, whether free will or any kind of physically undetermined event, would have contrastive explanations understood in a certain way. And I wanted to make a comment, eventually invite you to reply, but that in the recent philosophy of science literature, there's two different accounts of contrastive explanation. You might call them a strong account and a weak account. Peter Lipton gives this kind of demanding account, and Chris Hitchcock gives a weaker account. And part of what motivates Hitchcock is that a lot of people think that all explanation is contrastive explanation. So if you don't have contrastive explanation, you don't have explanation. Leibniz clearly thought that. But Hitchcock, being sensitive to probabilistic explanation in science, thought that's absurd. We give explanations for undetermined events all the time. That's what motivates his weaker account. So and I thought what you should say is, well, look, every truth or every event has an explanation, maybe not a certain kind of strongly contrastive explanation. And then if the reply comes back, yeah, well, what about the fact that A happened rather than B? You can say, well, that kind of fact either has an explanation or there is an explanation of why it has no explanation. That is, there's a kind of meta explanation for a physically undetermined system or a freely willing agent being the kind of thing it is. Its behavior just simply because it's indeterministic in character does not admit of that kind of explanation. But it's not a brute fact, right? It's not a tree appearing suddenly out there in the quad with no causal antecedents, there's an explanation of why. There's not a contrastive explanation of its behavior, or at least a strongly contrastive explanation. So I do think you disagree with Leibniz, but I think you're right, so stick to it.
Okay. Well, I noticed that the term explanation can be understood in different ways. And what I had in mind I didn't use the word explanation, I think, but I used the word sufficient reason. The idea I connected with that is mainly causal. It is a sufficient reason is a sufficient cause plus final causes. What were the aims of the agent, for example, when it causally made this event to happen? So a sufficient reason is always a sufficient cause, but a sufficient cause is a minimal sufficient reason. But you may, of course, want more for having a proper explanation. And you seem to be using the word explanation in a quite different sense, in the sense of basis. There are many events in physics for which, as far as we know, there's no sufficient physical reason. But of course, they have a physical basis. They have a context, they even have a probability of happening. And these probabilities follow natural laws. But if there is the probability 0.5 that this event will happen, the probability 0.5 that this event will not happen, and it happens, then you feel that there's a need. It's not, you can't say all is said what needs to be said. It's explained merely by saying that the probability is 0.5. There's lacking something. And that's exactly the sufficient cause.
Yeah, I have a comment. The Respondent, the idea that maybe miracles can occur very often. I think maybe this is not possible according to the concept of this. I don't know, but the question is how do we detect the laws of nature? Isn't the only possibility I see is that we observe what occurs many times, always in the same way, would be a law of nature, and then it would follow that. It cannot, that miracles can be only exceptions.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I had a side remark on that. I said there's no point in calling something a law of nature if it can be frequently broken. It's all right if it's sometimes broken, but not if it is frequently broken. And well, what I meant to say is our natural concept of law allows breaking the laws. But if a law is broken all the time, then, then it stops to be a law. Yeah.
Let me take up that point, because whether miracles break the laws depends on what we do mean by laws. And you didn't say very much about what you mean by laws.
No.
And we mean different things. People mean different things by laws. And I think the most traditional and adequate referent of the term law of nature is these formulas which contain an F, like the law of gravitation with the formulation with an F on the one side. Now, with that formulation, it's I don't think that a miracle is a violation of the laws, because that just says that there is a force in a certain situation, and God can move the stone, and all the forces will be there. He just moves the stone. There was the force that drags the stone down, and there's no need to call it a violation of the laws on that account. Now, others call equations of motion laws of nature, but then if you have equations of motion, you always need a completeness clause that there is nothing else acting, or you have to say it applies only ceteris paribus, but then ceteris paribus must also mean that there are no further factors acting, in which case also the law is not broken because it doesn't apply to the situation. I should think that only inadequate understandings of laws of nature lead to the notion that miracles are violations of the laws, like blown up Laplacian understandings which take all the laws and then feed a lot of in it. But I want to know what you mean by a law.
Yeah, I have a purely ontological conception of a law. It's a rule for the world, so it's probably a proposition which may not be formulable even. Also, there are some laws of nature which we all recognize, but they really don't follow from physics. I think it's a law of nature that every human being must die. But, well, does it follow from physics? I don't think so. It does. It doesn't. It doesn't, right? Well, yeah, entropy points in that direction, but entropy, as we know, is a statistical law, so it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't rule out, but nevertheless, I think it's a law of nature that we all will die.
No, that's really